The translator bead in Counselor Vethna's ear had been calibrated for 11,000 alien dialects. It had never failed her, not during the Krell annexation, not during the siege of Morrow Station, not during the 47 diplomatic summits she had attended in her 63 years of service to the harmonized ascendancy. It failed her now. "Play it again," she said. The junior officer, a young male of the Thawne caste, still slim-frilled and nervous in his formal sash, tapped the recorder panel. The voice filled the briefing chamber a second time. It was a human voice, male, baritone, steady as a load-bearing wall. The translator bead rendered the words faithfully. What it could not render was the tone. "He's not threatening them," Vethna said slowly. "He's not bargaining." "He is," she paused, 4 of her 6 fingers pressing together at her brow ridge. "He is explaining something to them, the way one explains mathematics to a child." The junior officer said nothing. There was nothing to say. On the screen behind the voice recording, the still image capture showed the human standing in the middle of the 7th Ascendancy Fleet's ceremonial deck. Around him, 11 warships of the line had arrayed themselves in formal deference formation, flanks angled inward, lights dimmed on the commanding prow lanterns. It was the arrangement one showed to an elder of supreme standing. It was the arrangement the Ascendancy had not shown to any being in 400 years of expansion. The human was not tall. He was perhaps in his mid-50s by human reckoning, with the particular weathered quality that their species accumulated from decades of difficult living. His hair had gone the color of ash. There were scars on the back of his left hand visible even in the low-resolution capture. He wore no insignia. He was not in uniform. He was wearing, as best as Vethna could determine, work clothes, the heavy canvas type their frontier populations favored. He was drinking something from a metal container. He was drinking something from a metal container, while 11 warships of the harmonized ascendancy saluted him. Vethna pulled up his file again. Brennan Caulfield, born in a coastal town on a secondary continent of Earth. Former, she scrolled, former commercial salvage operator. No military record, no diplomatic credentials, no political affiliation on record. He ran a small company, 4 people, 1 ship, a contract license to recover derelict material in the outer debris zones of the human system, and in recent years, the Ascendancy's outer transit corridors under the bilateral recovery accords. That was it. That was the entire record. "Who exactly is this human?" she asked, to no one in particular. The junior officer, to his credit, attempted an answer. "The fleet reports that he arrived in an unregistered vessel 3 weeks ago. He docked at Outpost Vane without clearance. The outpost commander attempted to detain him for processing. And the outpost commander is the one who called the fleet." Vethna turned to look at the junior officer directly. "The outpost commander called the fleet to detain a salvager in a workship." "Yes, Counselor." "Why?" The junior officer's frills darkened slightly with something that was not quite embarrassment and not quite awe. "Because she said, and I am quoting from her incident report, she said he didn't stop. She asked him to halt. He continued walking. She deployed 2 security officers. He walked between them. She deployed 6. He said," the officer checked his notes, he said, "I don't have time for this," and continued to the docking administrator's office, where he filed a standard salvage recovery claim for a derelict ascendancy vessel that had drifted into the outer belt 18 months ago. He filed a claim. A legal claim, yes. Under the Outer Belt Recovery Accords, any registered salvage operator may file for rights to a derelict vessel if it has been unattended for a period exceeding. "I know the accords." Vethna stood and moved to the broad viewing port. The station's outer ring was visible from here, and beyond it, the dark of space, and somewhere in that dark, 11 ships were still arranged in deference formation around a man in canvas work clothes. What was the derelict vessel? "Silence," She turned. The junior officer's frills had gone completely pale. The asterisk ascending permanence, counselor. The name hit the room like a depth charge. The asterisk ascending permanence had been the flagship of Fleet Admiral Rithka during the expansion of the Outer Arcs. It had been declared a monument vessel, a heritage site. Its loss 18 months ago to a navigational cascade failure had been treated as a matter of state mourning. A ship that had participated in 14 major engagements, that had carried the flag through the settlement of 7 border disputes and the opening of 3 new trade corridors, that had stood as a physical embodiment of what the Ascendancy called its finest era of peaceful expansion. A ship whose hull bore the seal of the founding council itself. 312 years old, irreplaceable, gone. 18 months sitting in the outer belt, breaking down in the thermal cycling, while the Ascendancy's legal and cultural institutions had argued about recovery priorities and funding channels and jurisdictional questions regarding the debris zone it had drifted into. Brennan Caulfield had filed a routine salvage claim on it. And the fleet had come not to stop him, but to salute. She found him 2 days later. It required some doing. He had not stayed on Outpost Vane. Once his claim was filed and provisionally accepted, the docking administrator, apparently too frightened or too curious or simply too tired of arguing with a man who walked through security deployments like they were suggestions, had rubber-stamped the intake form. He had departed back toward the outer belt in his workship. It had taken the fleet's fastest courier vessel to track him down, and even then, they'd had to wait 3 hours while he finished what he was doing. What he was doing was salvage. Vethna's shuttle pulled alongside his ship, the Indemnity Asterisk, a rust-streaked, mid-range recovery vessel of human manufacture, maybe 20 years old, covered in impact scoring and patch welds that told the story of a life lived in the hard places of space. And she boarded via the docking collar, accompanied by 2 of her staff and a single security officer. She had been told the human was not dangerous. She had decided to bring the security officer anyway, mostly for her own peace of mind. The interior of the Indemnity Asterisk smelled of machine oil and something warm and yeasty and human. The corridors were narrow. The lighting was slightly too warm for Ascendancy comfort preferences. There were personal effects pinned along the corridor walls, a child's drawing rendered in crayon colors, sealed behind a piece of thin plastifiber, showing a rocket ship, and a figure with ash-colored hair. A photograph taken in an obviously terrestrial environment, a coastal somewhere, rocks and salt spray, and 2 people who were obviously related to each other in the way that parents and adult children related, a specific quality of comfort in the posture. A small metal disc hung on a hook near the galley entrance, turning slowly in the recycled air. Everything was functional and nothing was decorative, and yet the walls were not bare. She found herself looking at the small disc as she passed. It caught the light and scattered it. He was in the cargo hold. The ascending permanence *S drive core housing, a component the size of a small ground vehicle, encased in the heritage-grade ceramite that had been the founding council's signature material, sat in the center of the hold, rigged to 4 cargo anchors and wrapped in protective webbing. Brennan Caulfield was crouched next to it with a scan instrument, reading outputs and making notes on a handheld. He didn't look up when she entered. "You're the counselor," he said, "not a question." "I am," Vethna said. "You are Brennan Caulfield." "I am," he made another note. "Give me 2 minutes." She gave him 2 minutes. She found, to her own surprise, that she did not mind waiting. There was something in the quality of his attention, focused entirely and without remainder on the component in front of him, unhurried, methodical, moving around the drive core and crouching and standing and peering at readout angles with the ease of someone who had done this 10,000 times, that she recognized from a very different context. It was the attention of an expert. She had been in rooms with experts before and she knew what it looked like. This still, this complete, this indifferent to anything outside the thing being examined. He stood eventually, tucked the handheld into a chest pocket, and looked at her directly. His eyes were an unremarkable brown. There was a specific kind of steadiness in them that she associated, in her experience, with people who had been frightened so many times that they'd made a private peace with it. "The drive core is intact," he said. "I was worried it wouldn't be. 18 months of thermal cycling in the outer belt can crack the casings on this generation of ceramite, and if it had cracked, the recovery wouldn't have been worth the fuel cost." He set the scan instrument on a nearby shelf. "It's fine. Minor surface degradation, nothing structural. The heritage archivists will be pleased." "You recovered the drive core," Vethna said carefully, "of the ascending permanence, and the ceremonial helm console, and the founding seal plate." He nodded toward the far corner of the hold, where two more shrouded components sat, rigged carefully, each wrapped with the same methodical thoroughness as the drive core. "The rest of the hull is too structurally compromised. I didn't try to recover it. No point in bringing scrap when you could spend the same effort on what's worth preserving." Vethna was quiet for a moment. "Why?" He looked at her. "Why what? Why did you recover it at all? The salvage value of those components." She did the rough calculation. Under current exchange rates, the ceremonial components carry cultural valuation that would be significant, yes, but the drive core of a heritage vessel is restricted resale. You cannot sell it on the open market. "I know. Then why did you file the claim? Why recover components you cannot profit from?" Brennan Caulfield looked at her with an expression that she could not immediately categorize. It was not irritation, though it was adjacent to irritation. It was more like the specific weariness of a person who has answered a question many times and finds it slightly sad that the question keeps being asked. He picked up the metal container from the shelf. She noticed he kept it where he could find it without looking, the habit of a person who moved through familiar spaces while thinking about other things, and drank from it. "Because it was sitting there," he said. 18 months. Nobody went to get it. Heritage vessel, you said, monument. And it was sitting there breaking down in the outer belt." He recapped the container. "That seemed wrong." Vethna looked at him. She looked at the drive core of the ascending permanence, wrapped carefully in its protective webbing. She looked at the two corner items, equally careful, equally wrapped. She looked back at him. "You recovered a monument vessel because it seemed wrong to leave it." "That's what I said. You are not a historian. You are not a diplomat. You are not affiliated with any government or cultural preservation organization. No. You are a salvage operator." "I am." "And you thought." "I thought someone should go get it." He set down the container. "Are we going to argue about this? Or are you going to tell me what you actually came out here to ask?" What she actually came out here to ask was more complicated than she had words for in any of the 11,000 dialects her translator bead covered. She asked the easy question first. "The fleet," she said, "Fleet Admiral Yenna's formation. You know what the deference arrangement means." "I've been operating in ascendancy space for 11 years, he said. "Yes, I know what it means. I asked them to stop, twice. They did not stop." "No." He said this with the tone of a man describing a mildly inconvenient weather event. A thing that happened, that he had attempted to address, that had proceeded regardless. "They didn't." "Why did Admiral Yenna order the formation?" He was quiet for a beat. Then he said, "You should probably ask her that." "I am asking you." He leaned against the cargo anchor strut, arms crossed, and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The tell of a person ordering their thoughts she recognized. Not evasion, actual thought. The kind of pause that preceded something real. 3 months ago, he said, I was operating in the debris field past the 9th transit marker. One of the Ascendancy's deep survey ships got caught in a cascade collision with uncharted material, 3 hull breaches, life support failing. 22 crew. He paused. He breathed once slowly, the way people breathed when they were managing something. I was the closest vessel. I docked, ran 6 crossings through the breach corridors while the hull was still venting, pulled out 17 survivors. The other 5, he stopped. His jaw was still for a moment. I couldn't reach the other 5 in time. Vethna was very still. Admiral Yenna lost a nephew on that ship, he said. He was not among the 17. She understood now. She wished she didn't, because understanding it made the weight of it real in a way that was uncomfortable. Yenna's deference formation had not been a diplomatic maneuver. It had not been a political signal or a calculated gesture designed to establish leverage. It had been a woman expressing something for which the ascendancy's formal ceremonial language had the form, even if it had been 400 years since the last occasion that justified its use. It had been grief finding the only formal shape big enough to hold it. You went through hull breach corridors, Vethna said, in a vacuum suit. In a partial vacuum suit. One of my seals was degraded. I'd been meaning to replace it. He said this the way people said things they had rehearsed to themselves many times, rolling the same stone smooth in the dark, until the saying of it became the way they kept moving forward rather than stopping. It was a calculated risk. 6 crossings. The 17th person was a child, he said, a research apprentice. 15 by your reckoning, maybe 14. She was jammed in a section that had lost power, no hand grips operational, floating in the dark. He looked at the wall. She'd been there for 40 minutes before I reached her, alone in the dark. She was holding onto a pipe fitting with both hands because it was the only thing that wasn't moving. Vethna did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would not be less than the moment. 6th crossing, he said, yes. After a silence, Admiral Yenna knows about the apprentice. The apprentice told her, he said. Apparently in some detail, apprentices are there thorough, they remember everything. And Yenna ordered the deference formation. Yenna ordered the deference formation. He looked at her. I didn't ask for it. I would have preferred she hadn't. It complicated my docking arrangement considerably. Vethna looked at this man for a long time. He did not look away and did not look uncomfortable. He was simply there in his work clothes in his salvage ship, with the recovered heart of a monument vessel wrapped carefully in the hold behind him, drinking from his personal container, looking at her with those steady, unremarkable eyes. What do you want? She asked finally, not as a negotiating opener, not as a diplomatic probe, as a genuine question. He frowned slightly, as though the question was oddly shaped. What do I want for what? For this, she gestured, encompassing the hold, the drive core, the ship around them, all of it. For the recovery, for the survey crew, for all of it. What does Brennan Caulfield want? He was quiet for longer this time than he had been quiet for any of her other questions. Long enough that she wondered if the question had landed wrong, if she had miscalibrated something. She had 40 years of reading rooms, 40 years of watching the space between a question and its answer, and she still could not read this one. Then he said, I want the Outer Belt Recovery Accords updated to include a provision for heritage material. Right now, if I find something culturally significant out there, and I recover it, and I file the claim, there's a 60-day window where any party can contest it and the material goes into legal holding. Meanwhile, it's sitting in my hold taking up space, and I can't do anything with it, and I'm paying for the storage volume out of my operating budget, and the material is depreciating in terms of conservation, because whoever designed the legal holding process didn't think about temperature cycling and vibration standards. He paused. That's not a sensible system. Vethna blinked. You want an amendment to the Recovery Accords? A small one, 2 clauses. I've written them out. He reached into his chest pocket and produced a folded sheet of paper, actual paper, she noticed, the fibrous kind that humans sometimes preferred for handwritten notes, slightly creased from being carried, and handed it to her. The legal language needs work. I'm not a lawyer. But the intent is clear. She unfolded the paper and read it. He was right. The legal language needed work. The intent was perfectly clear. He wanted a faster adjudication pathway for recovered heritage material, a 72-hour window rather than 60 days, and he wanted storage compensation rates set at a reasonable standard so that salvage operators recovering significant cultural artifacts were not economically penalized for doing so. The second clause also included a provision for emergency conservation measures to be authorized during the adjudication window, which suggested he had thought about this in some detail. It was, she thought, one of the more reasonable policy proposals she had read in 40 years of attending summits. She had attended summits where 300 representatives had spent 6 days producing documents less coherent than this. "You could have asked for anything," she said. "This is what I'm asking for." "The fleet is," she stopped, restarted. "Admiral Yenna and her fleet would do a great deal for you. The Ascendancy Council would do a great deal for you. You understand that?" "I understand that." He did not seem particularly moved by it, neither flattered nor uncomfortable, simply noting a fact. "The Recovery Accords amendment is what I need. The rest isn't things I need." "And maybe," he said, "if it's not too much trouble, a berth assignment at Outpost Vane that doesn't require me to negotiate with the docking administrator every time I come in. She's a good administrator, she runs a tight outpost, and I don't enjoy arguing with her. It wastes both our time." Vethna looked at this man. She thought about the 11 ships in deference formation. She thought about the survey vessel with 3 hull breaches and a degraded seal on a vacuum suit, and a child holding a pipe fitting in the dark for 40 minutes. She thought about the monument vessel sitting 18 months in the cold outer belt, and the person who had decided, not for profit, not for recognition, not for political leverage, simply because it seemed wrong to leave it there, to go and get it. She thought about the photograph on the corridor wall, the coastal somewhere, the 2 people who were obviously family. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her own pocket. "I'll see what I can do," she said. The council session was the following week. Vethna had been attending council sessions for 30 years. She knew the rhythms of them, the ceremonial openings, the procedural motions, the way disagreements calcified into factional positioning, the way the morning's debates became the afternoon's compromises, became the evening's eventual decisions. She knew how to read a room, not just the formal signals, the votes and the abstentions, but the smaller things. Who was looking at whom, who stopped talking when someone entered, who took notes and who only appeared to. She knew which counselors were performing and which were thinking. She knew when a session would be historic and when it would merely be long. This one, she knew from the opening, would be historic. It was not because of the policy proposal, though the policy proposal was sensible and would likely pass once the legal language had been properly drafted. It was not because of the presence of Fleet Admiral Yenna in the observer's gallery, which was unusual enough to draw attention but not unprecedented. It was not because the drive core of the Ascending Permanents had been delivered to the Ascendancy Cultural Archive that morning, along with the ceremonial helm console and the founding seal plate, with a transfer documentation signed by Brennan Caulfield in the same plain handwriting as his 2-clause policy proposal, with a note at the bottom that read, "Please ensure adequate temperature control for the ceramite components during the transition period. The outer belt cycling has stressed the material. It should be stable, but conservators should be aware." It was because of what happened before any of the formal business. The session opened with the customary reading of the calendar, the acknowledgement of business carried forward, and the formal recognition of any persons present in the chamber who bore visiting status. It was a formality, a ritual. In 30 years, Vethna had watched it produce perhaps 5 minutes of genuine interest, usually when a visiting dignitary of unusual stature was being recognized. The chamber notary read, The Council recognizes in the observer capacity Brennan Caulfield of Earth, registered salvage operator, operating license. And here followed the license number, the standard wording, the standard form, the same phrasing the notary used for every visiting merchant or independent contractor who attended a session. He was in the observer's gallery in his canvas work clothes. He had not been told to wear anything different. She realized, looking at him from her position at the council table, that it had not occurred to her to tell him to wear anything different, and that even if it had occurred to her, she suspected, with the quiet certainty of someone who had read a person correctly, that it would not have made a significant difference. He was dressed for the work he did. The work was what had brought him here. It seemed consistent. The council recognized him, the standard wording, the standard form. What happened next was not standard. Fleet Admiral Yenna stood. In 30 years, Vethna had never seen an admiral stand during a visiting recognition. The protocol simply did not exist for it, because the occasion had never arisen. One stood during the recognition of the Ascendancy's own leaders, during the recognition of allied heads of state, during the recognition of beings designated as honored of the First Order, a designation that had been granted exactly 9 times in the Ascendancy's recorded history. Yenna stood, and she stood without explanation, simply stood, with the particular stillness of someone who has made a decision and is not going to unmake it. And because Yenna stood, the 6 other fleet representatives in the gallery stood. And because they stood, the diplomatic observers from 3 aligned species stood. And because they stood, one by one, with the particular momentum of something that has been waiting for permission, every person in the observer's gallery was standing. It lasted perhaps 15 seconds. Brennan Caulfield looked at the room. His expression moved through several things in rapid succession. Surprise was first, then something that was not quite discomfort and not quite recognition, and then a kind of stillness that settled over him like a familiar coat. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been in versions of this moment before, in smaller forms, and had developed a way of receiving them that neither diminished them nor let them change his posture. He gave a small, single nod, the kind of nod that said, "I see you. I understand what you're doing. I accept it. I would personally prefer if we moved on, but I understand, and I am not unmoved, and I will carry this appropriately." The session proceeded. Later, much later, after the session had ended and the policy proposal had been formally submitted for legal drafting, and Admiral Yenna had done the thing that military officials did when they wanted to speak to someone without it being part of the formal record, which was to find them in a corridor and walk alongside them for a while without introducing the subject. Waiting. Vethna found Brennan Caulfield sitting on a bench in the outer rotunda, eating something from a container he'd brought with him. She sat down next to him without asking. "The legal drafting will take 2 months, she said. "Possibly 3. "That's fine." He offered her something from the container. She looked at it. It appeared to be a dense, slightly sweet grain-based preparation, cut into small squares, still holding its shape well. She took a small piece because it seemed like the right thing to do. "After that," she said, "the amendment will go to ratification. I expect it to pass." "Good. And the berth assignment at Outpost Vane is already sorted, I heard." He looked mildly pleased by this in the specific way that people looked mildly pleased when a long-standing administrative annoyance was resolved. Not grateful, exactly, but relieved in the practical sense. The administrator sent a message, very formal, very official. She signed it with 3 ceremonial acknowledgement stamps. She was embarrassed, Vethna said. She was doing her job, he said. There was no edge in it. She had a man walking through her security perimeter who didn't belong there, and she handled it according to protocol. The protocol happened to be insufficient for the specific situation, but that's not her fault. I didn't hold it against her. They sat in the comfortable silence of the outer rotunda. The sounds of the station moved around them, the distant hum of environmental systems, the murmur of other conversations, the soft percussion of footsteps on the polished floor. Vethna ate the piece of grain preparation and found it unexpectedly good. Dense and warm, and something at the back of the sweetness that she couldn't identify, but that felt like memory, which was not a thing she associated with food she had never eaten before. "What is this?" she asked. "My mother's recipe," he said. "She made it for long hauls, keeps for 2 weeks without refrigeration." He looked at the container. Very practical. She was a practical woman. Vethna thought about the photograph on the *indemnities* wall. The coastal, somewhere. The two people who were obviously family. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You're going to anyway." "The survey vessel, 3 months ago, 6 crossings with a degraded seal." She chose the words carefully. "Were you afraid?" He was quiet for a moment. The rotunda moved around them. "The first crossing," he said. "Yes, genuinely afraid. That particular kind where your body is trying to tell you something and you already know what it's saying and you're telling it you heard." He looked at his hands, the scars on the back of the left one. "By the 3rd one I didn't have time to be afraid. By the 5th one I was annoyed because the corridor geometry was awkward and I kept having to recalculate my anchor points, and the suit's timer function was reading differently from my head count, which I didn't trust." He paused. "Fear is useful until it isn't. Once you're in it, really in it, it just gets in the way." "That is not," she paused. "That is not how most people describe that kind of experience. Most people aren't salvage operators." He said it without pride, without false modesty. Simply as a statement of fact, the way one might say most people aren't plumbers or most people haven't worked in agricultural zones *. You spend enough time in places that are trying to kill you, you develop a working relationship with the possibility. You stop fighting the fear and start just noting it. Noted. Moving on. "The Apprentice," she said. His face changed slightly, not much. "Yes." "In the dark 40 minutes. 14 years old," he said. "Almost certainly. By human reckoning, I mean, I'm not sure of the ascendancy conversion." He paused. She hadn't let go of the pipe fitting. "I don't know if she couldn't let go or if she decided not to. I didn't ask her. She was talking when I got to her. Not to anyone in particular. Just talking. The way people do when they're alone in the dark and they need to hear a voice." Vethna did not say anything. "I told her we were going," he said. "I told her to put her arms around my neck and hold on, and I told her that the crossing was going to be loud and she shouldn't look down, and she did exactly what I told her, and she didn't make a sound all the way through." He looked at the middle distance. "Not one sound. 14 years old." "She told Admiral Yenna you hummed something." He was quiet. "Through the crossing," Vethna said. "She said you hummed something." He said after a moment, "Old habit. Long hauls, my mother used to." He stopped, turned the container in his hands. "It was nothing, just something to fill the quiet." The Apprentice said it helped. "Good," he said simply. She thought about this later, much later, in the quiet of her own office, with the session transcripts on her desk and the legal drafting committee's preliminary report on the amendment, and the catalog entry for the founding seal plate that had been processed into the archive that afternoon, and her own notes, written in the small, precise hand she'd maintained for 40 years. She thought about essential nature, the ascendancy concept, the quality of a being visible when everything circumstantial was removed. She had always framed it as something revealed in exceptional moments, the singular test, the crisis that stripped away pretense and showed what was underneath. She was beginning to think she had framed it wrong. What she kept returning to was not the 6 crossings, though the 6 crossings were real and mattered. It was the humming. It was the note at the bottom of the transfer documentation about temperature control for the ceramic. It was the mild, genuine relief about the birth assignment. It was the 2 clauses on folded paper that had not said "give me a title," or "give me a fleet," or "give me the recognition I'm owed." It was the grain preparation made from a practical woman's recipe for long hauls. The exceptional moments were the same material as the ordinary ones. They were not a different quality appearing under pressure. They were the ordinary quality, revealed under conditions where it couldn't be obscured. She wrote this down. She wasn't sure what she would do with it. She kept writing it down anyway. The navigation buoy turned out to be 800 years old. He had mentioned it almost as an afterthought, in a second conversation, producing a second piece of folded paper that contained coordinates and a brief technical description. He had found it 18 months before finding the asterisk ascending permanence. It had been in the same general debris zone, and he'd logged it and moved on because he'd had a paying contract, and the buoy's positioning suggested it wasn't an active hazard. "I've been meaning to get back to it," he said, with the tone of someone describing an item on a long list. She had dispatched a survey team. The survey team had sent back a preliminary assessment that required her to read the word "unprecedented" 17 times in 6 pages, which was not a word that appeared often in ascendancy survey assessments, because the ascendancy had been doing surveys for 3 centuries and had encountered most things. The specialists arrived on the asterisk indemnity to examine it in person. Brennan Caulfield showed them to the secondary hold, confirmed there was nothing structurally dangerous, and went to make tea. He had a habit of doing this. She had come to understand, over several conversations, that he offered tea not from social formality, but because it was a practical thing to do when other people were in his space, and it gave him something to do with his hands while they did what they needed to do. It was not a performance. It was the same practical instinct as the grain preparation and the temperature control note. She found him in the galley when the specialists had been in the secondary hold for 2 hours. She sat across from him at the small galley table, and he poured her something that was not technically tea but was warm and had depth to it, and they listened to the muffled sounds of 3 ascendancy specialists rewriting history 40 meters away. "That's going to be complicated," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "The amendment's going to need more than 2 clauses, isn't it?" "It's going to need quite a few more clauses." She looked at her cup. The warmth of it was good. "We may need an entirely new framework." He considered this with the same methodical attention he'd given to the scan readouts of the drive core housing, not alarmed, not excited, simply engaging with a logistical reality that had changed shape. That would take a while. "Yes." "Would it make sense," he said, "for me to be involved in drafting it, since I have direct operational experience with the problems in the current system? I know what breaks down in practice." Vethna thought about the council's reaction to this suggestion. She thought about Admiral Yenna. She thought about 11 ships in deference formation and 15 seconds of standing acknowledgement. She thought about the docking administrator with 3 ceremonial stamps. She thought about what it would mean to have a person like this. Not a person with credentials, not a person who had sought the position, not a person whose appointment would need to be defended to a dozen factions, but a person who had gone through 6 hull breaches and picked up a fallen monument from the outer belt, because it seemed wrong to leave it, involved in shaping the framework that governed how civilizations recovered what they had lost. "It would make a great deal of sense," she said. He nodded. "I'll need to keep operating. I have contracts. People depending on the income." "Of course. And I'm not going to be based on a station. I'll attend sessions remotely when necessary." "That can be arranged." And he paused. His hands were still on the table. "I want it on the record that I'm not a diplomat. I'm a salvage operator. I have no interest in titles or designations or whatever the ascendancy gives people in this situation. I don't need a title. I don't need the recognition. I need the framework to work better than it currently does, and I happen to know how it currently fails." "What does the ascendancy give people in this situation?" she asked genuinely. "I have no idea," he said. "That's why I'm flagging it." She thought about it. In 40 years of service, she could not think of a comparable situation. The forms did not exist for it. There was no established role for a civilian salvage operator who had, through a combination of stubbornness and decency, and a constitutive difficulty with leaving things that seemed wrong sitting alone in the outer belt, become essential to 3 separate active ascendancy matters simultaneously, and was likely to become essential to several more. "I'll have to improvise," she said. "You and me both," he said, and refilled her cup. The documentation took 3 weeks to finalize, because the forms genuinely did not exist, and her assistant had to work with the Ascendancy's legal office to create them, which was a process not unlike teaching a very formal and very old machine to do something it had never been designed for. When it was done, her assistant transmitted it to the indemnity asterisk, which was in the outer belt again. Because Brennan Caulfield had gone back to work the moment, the specialists were done with the secondary hold, and the archaeological removal team had taken the buoy into custody, because he had a contract to complete, and the outer belt did not care about historic discoveries or framework negotiations or administrative processes. The reply came 8 hours later, which was the transmission time plus whatever time he had taken to read it carefully. The reply read, "Confirmed receipt. 2 questions. 1. Does this change my docking status at Outpost Vane in any way I need to communicate to the administrator? She keeps a tidy log, and I'd rather she hear it from me than get a surprise official notification. 2. Is there a version of this document that doesn't require attendance in formal ceremonial dress for council sessions? I don't own formal ceremonial dress, and I'd rather not acquire it." Her assistant stared at this for a moment. Then she forwarded it to Vethna with no comment. Vethna's reply came back in 4 minutes. "Tell him. 1. He now has standing clearance at every Ascendancy outpost, station, and installation. The administrator should receive official notification by end of day, but please tell him he is welcome to inform her directly. She will appreciate the gesture. 2. Yes. Done. The provision has been struck. He may attend in whatever is appropriate for the work he does." Her assistant transmitted this. Brennan Caulfield's final reply came 6 hours later. "Thank you. While I was out here, I found a Krell survey marker. The positioning suggests there's a significant debris field about 40,000 kilometers north of the current transit corridor. I've attached coordinates. Recommend a survey vessel be dispatched before it becomes a navigation hazard, the marker's degrading, and once it goes dark the field won't be flagged on anyone's charts." Her assistant read this 3 times. Then she pulled up the contact for the survey division, then the Archaeological Council, then Outpost Vane's docking administrator, not to send an official notification, which was already in process, but to send a personal message, because a man who had walked through her security deployment in work clothes and filed a routine salvage claim on a monument vessel had apparently mentioned to the counselor that he didn't want the administrator to receive a surprise official notification and would rather she hear it directly, and her assistant thought the administrator should know that. She did all of these things, and then she sat back, and she looked at Caulfield's file 1 more time. She added a 5th page. Then she thought about it and added space for a 6th, because this was clearly going to keep going. The Krell debris field turned out to contain a cache of materials that opened 4 new research programs. The navigation buoy's origins were eventually dated to 3 centuries before the Ascendancy's own written records, a civilization that both species had, through independent but identical oversights, missed entirely. Brennan Caulfield did not attend any of the symposia this produced. He sent responses to direct queries from researchers who reached him through the official channels, and the responses were always brief and practical, and contained exactly the information requested and no additional commentary. One researcher, a young Ascendancy historian who had been working on the implications of the buoy discovery for 2 years, later described receiving one of these responses as the most disorienting experience of her professional career. A three-sentence reply from the person who had, through the act of logging a coordinate rather than moving on, fundamentally changed her field, written with the same tone one might use to describe the location of a supply cache. The framework passed. The accords were updated. The new provisions worked better in practice than the old ones had, which was not a surprising outcome given that they had been drafted partly by the person who knew best where the old ones failed. The Krell debris field survey yielded 3 more sets of coordinates, attached to mission reports over the following year, each with a brief note explaining what Caulfield had observed and why he thought it might be significant. Each one was right. Years later, Vethna was asked to speak at the Ascendancy Cultural Institute's annual gathering on the topic of essential nature. The ascendancy concept she had spent her career thinking about and had, in her later years, come to understand differently. She stood at the lectern and looked at the gathered scholars and said, "I spent 40 years believing that the ascendancy had seen everything, not from arrogance, from experience. 40 years of expansion and engagement and diplomacy. 40 years of meeting the galaxy's varieties of intelligence and life and intention. I thought I had a comprehensive catalog." She paused. "Then I met a salvage operator," she said, "who went through 6 hull breaches with a degraded vacuum seal because it didn't seem right to leave people in there. Who recovered a monument vessel because it didn't seem right to leave it sitting in the cold. Who wrote 2 policy clauses on a piece of paper because the system seemed inefficient and it bothered him. Who hummed something to a 14-year-old in the dark during a 6th crossing through a venting corridor because she was afraid, and it was the thing that was available to give." She looked at her notes, set them aside. "He did not know he was doing anything significant," she said. "He was doing what seemed correct. He was doing what the situation called for. He was being himself, which in his case happened to be someone for whom leaving things that seemed wrong was more uncomfortable than whatever was required to address them. Not because he was extraordinary, not because he had decided to be a certain kind of person, but because this is what he was. The same in small situations as in large ones. The same in the outer belt as in the council chamber. The same in work clothes as he would have been, I suspect, in whatever formal dress we might have tried to impose." She looked at the room. "We debate," she said, "whether essential nature can be known separately from action. I believe, after everything I have described, after all that followed, that the answer is no. Essential nature is not a quality that exists independently and expresses itself occasionally in moments of crisis. It is visible in the doing. It is in the 3rd hull crossing and the 4th and the 5th. It is in the careful wrapping of the drive core. It is in the 2 policy clauses and the berth assignment and the note about temperature control for the ceramite and the coordinates attached to mission reports over years, each one right, each one offered without comment or expectation." She looked at the room. "The human word for it," she said, "is character asterisk. And in 11,000 dialects across 40 years of attending everything the galaxy has to offer, I have not found a better one." Brennan Caulfield, for his part, did not attend the lecture. He had a contract in the outer belt. He did read the transcript, which Vethna's assistant sent to him 3 weeks later, because it seemed like something he should have. His reply when it came was 4 lines. "Thank you for sending this. I don't think I'm what she described, but I think she was describing something real. It just might have a different source than she's giving me credit for. The work does something to you. The outer belt does something to you. You learn what you're for." He paused in the rhythm of the sentences, and then, "I found something interesting near the 7th transit marker. Attaching coordinates. Don't dispatch a survey vessel yet. I want to get a closer look first. We'll send a follow-up report." Her assistant forwarded this to Vethna with no comment. No comment was necessary. Some people did not arrive in history through the great formal events. They arrived through the accumulated weight of small correct actions, each one chosen for no reason more complicated than that it seemed wrong not to, until the weight of them was enough to change the room, and then the station, and then the frame of what was possible between two civilizations across the cold dark of the outer belt. 400 years, the ascendancy had not used the deference formation. It had been waiting, apparently, for the right occasion. The right occasion had arrived in canvas work clothes, drinking from a metal container, asking for 2 clauses in the recovery accords and a reasonable birth assignment. The ascendancy had given him both, and a good deal more besides. He had given them back the ascending permanence, and the navigation buoy, and the Krell coordinates, and the follow-up coordinates, and 3 years of follow-up reports, and something harder to name, the particular quality visible in a being who knows what they are and does not require it to be confirmed by others, who moves through the galaxy in work clothes with a practical woman's grain recipe, and the habit of checking their seal before every crossing, even when they've been meaning to replace it for months. The apprentice, by the time of Vethna's lecture, had completed her research training and been assigned to a deep survey ship. She kept a photograph in her quarters, not of the breach corridors, not of the ascending permanence, but of the outer belt itself, a still taken from the asterisk indemnity's asterisk viewing port on the day she'd gone back out with Caulfield to collect the ceremonial helm console, 2 weeks after the rescue. He had let her come. She had asked, and he had thought about it and said yes. She was 17 by then. She had stood at the viewing port for a long time, looking at the dark and the debris and the stars past the debris, and she had not said anything, and he had not said anything either, and eventually they had both gone back to work. The photograph was of the dark between the debris fields, the stars past the debris, the particular quality of a space that had been a hard place and was now simply a place she had been in, a place she had come through, a place she now knew the coordinates of. She kept it because it looked, she said, like something worth coming back to. She was right. There was a moment, early in all of this, before the framework, before the buoy, before the symposia and the lecture and the photograph on the survey ship wall, that Vethna returned to sometimes. Not the deference formation, not the council chamber, not the cargo hold with the wrapped drive core. She returned to the corridor of the asterisk indemnity asterisk on her first visit, walking between the narrow walls with their machine oil smell and their slightly too warm lighting, the photograph of the coastal somewhere, the child's drawing in its plastifiber seal, the small metal disc turning in the recycled air, catching light and scattering it. She had not said anything about the disc. She had not asked. It seemed like something personal, and she had enough experience of professional life to know that the personal objects people kept in their working spaces were not always things they wanted explained. But she had looked at it as she passed, and she had thought, that is not functional, that is not practical. That is a piece of someone's life, brought along into a hard place, for reasons that have nothing to do with efficiency. And then she had thought, but it turns. It catches the light. Every time he passes it, it catches the light. And in the outer belt, in the debris fields, in the breach corridors and the temperature cycling and the dark between the debris fields, the light is worth having. She had not thought about this for some time. She thought about it now, sitting in her office with the follow-up coordinates on her desk and the follow-up report not yet written. She thought the work does something to you. The outer belt does something to you. You learn what you're for. She thought about 40 years of summits and accords and diplomatic formations and formal sessions. She thought about what they had done to her and what she was for. She thought, I have spent 40 years in rooms where people decide things. I have learned in those rooms how things get decided. I have learned which arguments work and which don't, which factions move and which hold, which moments are opportunities and which are walls. I am very good at this. It is genuinely useful. She thought, but I do not hum in breach corridors. I do not go through 6 crossings with a degraded seal. I do not carry a small metal disc that catches light through the outer belt because the light is worth having. She thought, I wonder what that's worth. Not the humming, not the crossings, those have obvious value that I can explain to a council. I mean the disc, the catching of light. The thing that serves no function except to remind a person, every time they pass it in a narrow corridor that smells of machine oil, that there are things worth carrying. She did not answer this question that evening. She was not sure it had an answer that could be written in a policy document or argued in a session or ratified by committee. She did, however, do something she had not done in approximately 30 years. She went home, not to her official quarters, but to the personal residence she maintained on the station's residential level and rarely used because the official quarters were closer to everything that mattered, and she looked at the things on her own walls. There was not much. 40 years of professional life in which she had prioritized proximity to work over the accumulation of personal space did not produce abundant walls. There was a commendation, a photograph of a session she had attended where something genuinely good had been decided 3 decades ago. A small painting done by her eldest niece when the niece was 6, still bright despite the years, showing Vethna at a desk surrounded by papers that were, in the painting, larger than she was. She looked at the painting for a long time. The niece was now an adult, with children of her own. She thought, I should call her. She did the next morning. The conversation lasted 40 minutes, which was longer than any conversation she had had on personal subjects in the past year. Possibly longer than any conversation she had had on personal subjects in the past several years. The niece asked what had prompted it. Vethna thought about how to explain. She said, I met someone who carries a small metal disc that catches light. The niece said after a pause, that sounds nice. It is, Vethna said, it is very nice. The niece laughed, and Vethna laughed, and the conversation went other places. And when it was over, Vethna sat for a moment in the residential space she rarely used and felt the weight of 40 years arranged differently than it had been before, not lighter, not heavier, just differently arranged, the way you shifted a cargo load to improve the balance. The follow-up coordinates from Brennan Caulfield sat on her desk in the official quarters. She would get to them in the morning. Tonight she was home. The follow-up report came in 4 days later, not weeks. Whatever Caulfield had found at the 7th transit marker, he had moved quickly. The report was longer than his usual transmissions, 6 pages rather than the standard 2 or 3, and included imaging, spectral analysis, and a preliminary structural assessment that suggested he had spent considerable time on site rather than making a single pass. The cover note was brief. This one is different. I don't want to say more until you've read the report. I've included my recommendation at the end. She read the report. She read the recommendation at the end. She sat back. The recommendation at the end was not for a survey vessel. It was not for an archaeological team or a legal framework consultation or a dispatch to the outer transit corridor. The recommendation read, I think this needs to involve the Krell, not their government. I don't know enough about their internal politics to navigate that, but whoever handles their heritage matters. There's something in this debris field that I think belongs to them, and I think they should know it's here. I'll leave the logistics to you. I just wanted to flag it. She read this 3 times. Then she sat back and thought about what it meant, not administratively, but in the larger sense. A human salvage operator in the outer belt had found something that might belong to the Krell, a species that had historically not had uncomplicated relations with either the ascendancy or humanity, and his first instinct had been not to leverage it, not to use it as a bargaining position, not even to report it internally, and let the diplomatic apparatus handle the decision about disclosure. His first instinct had been, this belongs to them, tell them. She thought about this for a long time. Then she pulled up the contact files for the Krell Heritage Commission, which she had not used in 15 years, and she started composing a message. The message was delicate. 15 years of dormancy in a diplomatic channel was a long time, and the circumstances that had made the channel dormant were still in living memory for both parties. She chose the words carefully, the way she always chose words in difficult situations, not to conceal anything, but to find the framing that allowed the truth to be received rather than deflected. She wrote 3 drafts. She sent the 4th. The response came in 9 days, which was faster than she had expected. The Krell Heritage Commission was cautious in its phrasing, but it was there. It was asking questions. It was, which she had not dared to assume, willing to receive the information. She relayed Caulfield's coordinates and his report to the commission, with a cover note that attributed the discovery accurately. The commission's second response came in 11 days. It was longer. It was, in places, something that she could only describe as moved, a quality she had rarely encountered in Krell official communications, a species that ran generally toward the formal and the restrained. They wanted to know more about the human, the salvage operator, how he had found the site, what he had done with it, what he had recommended. She sent them the full record, the ascending permanence, the survey vessel, the framework, the 2 clauses, the deference formation, all of it. The commission's third response began with a sentence she had never expected to receive in a professional communication from the Krell in her lifetime. "We would like to know if this person would be willing to speak with us directly." She forwarded this to the asterisk indemnity with a brief note. "You have reached, by being yourself, somewhere that 40 years of formal diplomacy could not." His reply came 7 hours later. "I'll need to know more about what they want to discuss. I'm not a diplomat, and I want to be clear about that from the start so they're not expecting something I can't provide. But yes, tell them yes." She told them yes. The meeting between Brennan Caulfield and the Krell Heritage Commission took place 6 weeks later, on a station in the neutral corridor, via secure transmission, because the distance was impractical otherwise. Vethna sat in on it at Caulfield's request. She suspected he wanted someone in the room who knew both contexts, or at least someone he recognized, which amounted to the same thing. She watched him speak to the commission. He was the same in that room as he had been in the cargo hold and the council chamber and the outer rotunda with the grain preparation. The same attention, the same directness, the same uncomplicated willingness to say, "I don't know," when he didn't know, which he did 3 times in the first hour, and which she watched the commission register each time with an attention that was not disapproval, but something more like recalibration. At one point, one of the commission's senior members asked him why he had flagged the discovery for the Krell, rather than handling it internally to the ascendancy framework. He said, "Because it seemed like it was yours." The commission member was quiet for a moment. "You did not know that," the member said. "You had a preliminary assessment, not certainty." "No," he agreed. "But the preliminary assessment was enough to make me think I should tell you before I told anyone else. If I'd been wrong, it would have cost a diplomatic contact and some awkwardness. If I'd been right and hadn't told you, that's a different kind of cost." The commission member made a sound that did not translate through the translator bead. Not a word, a sound. Later, after the session, she asked the Krell liaison what the sound had meant. The liaison was a young member of the commission's administrative staff who had been assigned to the neutral corridor specifically for this contact, and who had very good ascendancy, which was why she'd been assigned. The liaison said, "The sound is what you make when something turns out to be what you hoped it would be, when the shape of a thing is better than you were cautious enough to expect." Vethna looked at the liaison. The liaison looked back. "He doesn't know he does it," the liaison said. "Does he?" "No," Vethna said. "I don't think he does." "That makes it more," the liaison said, "not less." 3 years after the Neutral Corridor meeting, the Krell and the Ascendancy opened a Joint Heritage Commission, the first formal cooperative cultural institution between the two civilizations. Its founding was attributed, in the official documentation, to years of diplomatic groundwork. In the unofficial history, the one that circulated among historians and archivists and the people who had actually been in the rooms, it was attributed to a salvage operator who had found a debris field and sent coordinates to someone who would know what to do with them, along with a note that said, "I think this belongs to them." Brennan Caulfield was not present at the signing ceremony. He was in the outer belt. He sent a message that arrived on the day of the signing, heard about the commission. "Good, I found something else, attaching coordinates." There were, as always, coordinates attached. There were, as always, more things out there than anyone had yet gone to get. He was, as always, going to get them.